What would you do if the person on trial in your courtroom wasn't just a stranger, but your childhood best friend? That's exactly what happened to Judge Marcus Blake in this unbelievable case that shook the state of Louisiana. The woman in handcuffs wasn't just any defendant. She was Valerie Green, the girl who once taught him how to dream under southern stars. "You don't belong behind that bench," she says, her voice laced with decades of pain. Her words cut deeper than any cross-examination. This isn't just a courtroom drama, it's a confrontation with history, guilt, and the quiet cruelty of missed chances. As Frederick Douglass once said, "Where justice is denied, where poverty is enforced, neither persons nor property will be safe." This story may just change how you think about fairness forever. If it stirs something in you, don't scroll past. Subscribe, drop your thoughts in the comments, and let's keep these powerful stories alive. The courtroom buzzed with the usual tension. Whispers from the gallery, the shuffle of legal documents, and the distant echo of a gavel in another chamber. Judge Marcus Blake adjusted his robe and glanced at the docket. Just another case, he told himself. Just another name on a long list. But that illusion shattered the moment the bailiff spoke. Next case, the state of Louisiana versus Valerie Green. The name hit him like a punch to the chest. Marcus blinked, unsure if he'd heard right, but then the doors opened, and she walked in, wrists bound in cuffs, beige prison uniform hanging loosely on her frail frame, gray hair pulled into a tight knot. It was her, Valerie Green. His Valerie. For a split second, time froze. Marcus sat motionless, his gavel slipping slightly beneath his fingers. He hadn't seen her in over 30 years, not since that summer in Mississippi when their lives had diverged like opposite forks in a road. He became a symbol of law and order. She had vanished into the silence of systemic neglect. Valerie didn't look at him. Her eyes remained downcast as the bailiff guided her to the defendant's chair. But Marcus could see the wear on her face, the years, the disappointments, the quiet battles. Still, under all that, it was her, the girl who taught him how to ride a bike, the girl who had once read books aloud to him under the creaky porch light of her grandmother's shotgun house, the girl who had dared to dream out loud when the world told her to keep quiet. Rising tension pulsed through the room as the prosecutor launched into the charges: assault and robbery of a convenience store clerk. A grainy surveillance video, a vague witness description, no solid forensic evidence. But Valerie, now 47, sat there accused like so many others before her. Marcus kept his composure, years of judicial training, locking his face into stillness, but his mind ran wild. He remembered the last time he saw her. She was 17, angry tears on her cheeks as the police shoved her into the back of a cruiser. They said she had resisted arrest during a protest, but Marcus knew the truth. She had spoken up when she should have stayed silent, or so the sheriff said. Marcus had watched from his father's patrol car, paralyzed by fear and duty. He said nothing. Now, she was back, not as a voice of protest, but as a defendant in his courtroom. The prosecution called it an open and shut case. A clerk had suffered a broken wrist and minor bruising. Money was stolen. Valerie was found 2 blocks away, out of breath and without ID. But something about it didn't sit right with Marcus. The suspect in the video wore a red hoodie. Valerie had nothing red when arrested. No hoodie, no blood, no bruises, just tired eyes and a defeated posture. He glanced at the defense attorney, a young Latina woman named Aisha Ramirez. Her presence alone gave Marcus a sliver of hope. She looked determined, focused, like someone who still believed the system could be more than a machine. As the first motions were filed and the jury settled in, Marcus struggled to stay present. His courtroom was no longer just a place of law. It had become a battleground of memory, guilt, and buried truth. He wasn't just a judge. He was a man staring down the ghost of a choice he never had the courage to make. When court recessed for lunch, Marcus retreated to his chambers, but his mind remained stuck on the past. He remembered Valerie's voice under the stars. "You ever think about getting out of here? Like really leaving? Starting fresh?" Back then he had laughed it off. Now he wondered if she had meant it as a warning. As the day drew to a close, Marcus returned to the bench, watching her from the corner of his eye. She hadn't looked at him once. That, somehow, hurt more than any accusation. He tapped his gavel, voice even. Court will resume tomorrow at 9. Valerie was escorted out without a word. And for the first time in his career, Judge Marcus Blake wasn't sure he could be impartial, not because of bias, but because of truth. Because sometimes, justice wasn't blind. It just refused to look back. It was well past midnight when Marcus Blake found himself staring at the ceiling of his modest downtown apartment. Unable to sleep, the echo of Valerie's name still rang in his head. He had presided over hundreds of cases, sent men and women to prison, granted mercy, delivered justice, but this felt different. It wasn't just another case. It was the past returning to the present, dressed in beige and wearing handcuffs. He rolled out of bed, padded barefoot to the kitchen, and poured himself a glass of water. The cold silence reminded him of home. His real home, back in rural Mississippi. Dirt roads, no streetlights, the creak of the porch swing, and Valerie Green. She had always been the wild one, the brave one, where he kept quiet to survive. She spoke up to resist. Their friendship had started by accident. When he was 9 and she was 10, Marcus had wandered too far into the woods and fallen into a shallow creek. Valerie had found him, pulled him out, and handed him a towel from her backpack like she'd been expecting to rescue someone all along. From that moment, they were inseparable. They did everything together, rode their bikes past whites-only signs, dared to sit side by side at the corner store, swapped comic books and whispered dreams under the stars. Valerie talked about becoming a writer or a teacher. Marcus dreamed of law school, even though he never said it out loud. But then came the summer of 9. Marcus remembered it vividly. Valerie had been organizing a protest against the school board's decision to defund the one black school in town. His father, Deputy Blake, told Marcus to stay away. "That girl's trouble," he warned. "She'll ruin your future." Marcus didn't listen at first. He showed up to the protest, hiding behind the crowd, watching Valerie lead chants with her hand in the air and fire in her voice. That night, police stormed the protest. Valerie was arrested, accused of resisting and assaulting an officer. Everyone in town knew it was a lie. But Marcus, he did nothing. He watched from the passenger seat of his father's cruiser as Valerie was thrown into the back of a squad car. Their eyes met through the window, and she shook her head slowly, not in anger, in disbelief. And that was the last time he saw her, until now. Back in court the next morning, Valerie sat stone-faced as opening statements resumed. The prosecution painted her as a career criminal, someone who had never found a stable job, who had run-ins with the law in multiple states. They didn't mention poverty. They didn't mention trauma. They didn't mention the years she'd spent working dead-end jobs to take care of her sick mother. The defense attorney, Aisha Ramirez, stood with quiet authority. "The prosecution wants you to believe my client is a threat to society. But what they won't tell you is that she was never even identified at the scene. The witness didn't get a clear look. The surveillance footage is grainy at best, and there's no physical evidence linking her to the crime." The courtroom murmured. Marcus kept his face neutral, but inside, his heart raced. Valerie still hadn't looked at him. The first witness was called a store clerk named Carl Jenkins. He testified that the attacker was wearing a red hoodie, argued with the cashier, and leapt over the counter before fleeing with the cash drawer. Aisha's cross-examination was surgical. "Mr. Jenkins, did you see the person's face?" "Not really," he admitted. "The hood was up. It all happened fast." "And can you say with certainty that the person sitting here today was the one who robbed you?" Carl hesitated. "I can't be 100% sure." "No further questions, Your Honor." The tension in the room shifted slightly. The jury exchanged glances. Marcus felt it too. Doubt. After a short recess, court resumed. The prosecution played the surveillance footage. A blurry black and white video showing a figure in a red hoodie moving quickly through the store. The figure's face was never visible. Valerie watched the footage with a blank expression, arms folded tightly. Marcus watched her. He remembered the look in her eyes, the night of the protest, fierce, unapologetic, and hurt. She had believed in justice back then. Did she still? As court adjourned for the day, Valerie was escorted out once again. This time, she glanced back, not at the jury, not at her lawyer, but at Marcus. Their eyes locked for just a second, and in that glance, he saw everything: the years lost, the betrayal, and something else. A question. Would he finally do the right thing? Marcus sat frozen, his gavel still in his hand. For the first time he realized that maybe justice wasn't just something you delivered. Maybe it was something you had to earn. The morning sun filtered through the courthouse windows, casting long slivers of light across the polished floor. Judge Marcus Blake entered the courtroom with a tightened jaw and a storm in his chest. He had barely slept. The weight of Valerie's gaze from the day before haunted him like a verdict with no appeal. He took his seat, adjusted his robe, and glanced briefly toward the defense table. Valerie was already there, calm, quiet, unreadable. "Court is now in session," the bailiff announced. Aisha Ramirez stood and called her next witness. "Your Honor, the defense calls Officer Daniel Harris to the stand." Marcus stiffened. He knew that name. Officer Harris was the arresting officer, the man who had taken Valerie into custody. A burly white cop in his early 50s. Harris had the kind of face carved by years of skepticism and authority. He took the oath with an air of confidence, as if he'd done this 100 times. Aisha approached slowly, her voice steady. "Officer Harris, on the night of March 12th, you detained Ms. Valerie Green 2 blocks from the scene of a reported robbery. Is that correct?" "Yes, ma'am," Harris replied. "And what led you to believe she was the suspect?" "She matched the description. Black female, mid to late 40s, wearing dark pants and sneakers. Looked out of breath. Nervous." Aisha nodded. "Was she wearing a red hoodie?" "No," Harris admitted. "But she could have taken it off." "Did you find a red hoodie in her possession?" "No." "Did you search the surrounding area for it?" "No. We didn't have time. We were trying to secure the scene." "So," Aisha pressed, "you arrested her based solely on her proximity to the scene and a vague description?" Harris's jaw tightened. "I followed standard protocol." Aisha took a beat, then leaned in. "Is that what justice looks like to you, officer?" Objections flared, and Marcus raised a hand. Sustained. "Counsel, keep it professional." "Yes, Your Honor," Aisha replied, but the damage was done. The jury had heard the crack in the officer's credibility, and Marcus had felt it in his gut. After Harris left the stand, Aisha introduced her next witness, a forensic analyst named Dr. Michelle Young. She was sharp, precise, and unflinching. "I've reviewed the surveillance footage," she explained. "Based on the height, build, and movement patterns of the individual in the video, I cannot conclusively say that it is Ms. Green. In fact, there are several inconsistencies in the footage's timestamp, which suggest it may have been altered or misrecorded." Gasps murmured through the gallery. The prosecutor tried to push back, but it was clear the foundation of their case was cracking. The evidence was circumstantial. The identification was shaky. The assumptions were piling up, and Aisha was knocking them down one by one. Then came the moment that no one expected. "Your Honor," Aisha said, standing tall, "my client would like to testify on her own behalf." Marcus's heart skipped. He looked at Valerie, whose hands were folded calmly on the table. She nodded once. "Are you sure about this?" he asked. "I am, Your Honor," she replied, voice firm. She took the stand with quiet dignity. The courtroom held its breath. "I'm not a perfect person," Valerie began. "I've made choices I regret. I've worked too many jobs that didn't pay enough, lived in too many places where safety wasn't guaranteed. But I didn't rob that store. That night, I was walking home from my friend Dion's house. He lives 3 blocks from that store." "Why isn't Dion here to testify?" the prosecutor interrupted. "Because he's scared," she said plainly. "Scared of what happens when you speak up in a system that doesn't listen." Valerie paused, scanning the jury. I'm tired of being reduced to a statistic. I'm tired of being the face of fear when I've spent my life afraid. I'm not here asking for sympathy. I'm asking for fairness, for someone to finally say, maybe this woman deserves to be believed. Her voice didn't shake, but Marcus could feel his own resolve slipping. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that only follows truth. When she stepped down, Marcus watched her return to her seat with her head held high. As the court recessed for the day, he remained on the bench a moment longer, staring at the empty witness stand. For the first time in a long time, Judge Marcus Blake wondered if the law he served was enough. Not the rule book, not the process, but the principle it was supposed to protect: justice, real justice, the kind that sees, the kind that listens, the kind that does more than follow protocol, the kind that remembers the people it almost forgot. The courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the back row, their pens ready, cameras flashing every few minutes. The tension was palpable, the kind you could almost taste in the air, thick and electric. Judge Marcus Blake sat behind the bench, trying to control the thunderstorm brewing behind his calm expression. He knew today would be the turning point, and deep down he feared it might break him. The prosecution launched their final offensive. Their closing argument was sharp, calculated, and cold. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the district attorney began, pacing slowly. "This case may seem murky on the surface, but at its heart, it is simple. Miss Valerie Green was found 3 blocks from the scene, wearing clothes similar to the description. She had no identification, no alibi willing to speak under oath. The man who owns the convenience store was assaulted, money was stolen, and she was in the wrong place at the wrong time." The DA turned to the jury, lowering his voice for effect. "Justice demands accountability, even when the evidence isn't perfect." Marcus watched the jurors. Some nodded. Others looked unconvinced. One young woman near the back bit her lip, eyes darting between Valerie and the prosecutor. It was a room suspended in uncertainty. Then Aisha Ramirez stood. She didn't pace. She didn't raise her voice. She simply stood beside her client, both hands resting on the table. "My client is not a statistic. She's not a shadow in a hoodie. She's a woman who has survived more than most of us could imagine. Poverty, loss, stereotypes. And now, this being accused of a crime with no direct evidence, no solid witness, and no motive. Why would she rob a store just blocks from where she's staying with a friend? Why risk everything for a few crumpled bills?" She turned to the jury, eyes burning with conviction. "We ask juries to be the voice of reason, the guardians of fairness. If you convict her based on fear or assumption, what are you really saying? That being poor and nearby is enough? That being a black woman in the wrong zip code makes you guilty?" Silence blanketed the room. Marcus gripped the edge of his bench, steadying himself. The jury was dismissed to deliberate. Hours passed. The courtroom emptied and refilled several times as people stretched their legs and whispered theories. Marcus remained at his post. He stared at the seal above his head. Equal justice under law, words he had sworn to uphold, words that now felt like a dare. Valerie sat quietly beside Aisha. She didn't fidget or look around. She simply waited. She had done this before, waited for decisions made by people who didn't know her, who might never see her as fully human. Marcus watched her and felt shame bloom in his chest like fire. He should have spoken up back then. He should have defended her when they were kids. Instead, he watched her get dragged away by cops. And now, decades later, she was sitting in his courtroom, still shackled by a system he served. The door creaked. The bailiff stepped forward. "They've reached a verdict." Everyone filed back in. Valerie stood. The jury re-entered, faces unreadable. The foreperson, a woman in her early 60s with trembling hands, rose with a slip of paper. "In the case of the state of Louisiana versus Valerie Green, we find the defendant." A pause stretched across the room like a held breath. "Not guilty." The room erupted. Murmurs, gasps, a few quiet cheers. Valerie didn't move. Her shoulders slumped. but her expression stayed guarded, like someone who'd been told she could exhale, but wasn't sure it was safe. Marcus tapped the gavel. Order, order in the court. Valerie turned to Aisha, who smiled with tears in her eyes. But it wasn't triumph, it was survival. There, you are free to go, Miss Green, Marcus said, his voice tight. As the room emptied, Valerie lingered at the defense table signing release papers. Marcus stood to leave, but paused at the door. Valerie, he said quietly. She turned. You don't owe me anything, she said before he could speak. But I want to know, why didn't you say anything? He looked down. Because I couldn't. It would have compromised the case. She shook her head. You mean it would have compromised you? His mouth opened, then closed. I was a kid, he finally said. Back then, I didn't know what to do. But you do now, she replied, steady as ever. Don't you? Marcus nodded. I do, and I'm sorry. Valerie stared at him for a long moment. Then, without another word, she turned and walked out the courtroom doors, free, but carrying the weight of a lifetime. Marcus stood alone in the silent courtroom, wondering if justice had been done, or if it had merely been delayed. The next morning, the courthouse steps stood quiet under the early light, washed in a soft golden hue. Judge Marcus Blake stood there alone, briefcase in hand, eyes scanning the sidewalk where Valerie had walked away just hours earlier. It felt like something had been torn open inside him, and now the silence was louder than any gavel he'd ever struck. Inside his chambers, Marcus poured a black coffee and stared at the wall. His nameplate sat neatly on his desk. His robe hung clean behind the door, and yet something about the space felt hollow. He'd upheld the law, he'd maintained composure, but for the first time he questioned whether that had been enough. Later that day, he sat in on a judicial review board meeting. Routine policy evaluations, procedural discussions, dry language about efficiency and case quotas. But all Marcus could hear was Valerie's voice echoing from the witness stand. I'm tired of being reduced to a statistic. That afternoon, he canceled his next 2 appointments and took a walk down to the city's public defender's office. It was a small brick building, nestled between a used bookstore and a sandwich shop. He hadn't been there in years. Inside, the secretary looked up, surprised. Judge Blake? I'm not here as a judge today, he said. I'd like to speak with someone about volunteer outreach. Outreach? Yes, youth mentorship, maybe, or early intervention programs. Anything that keeps people like Valerie from ever needing to walk into my courtroom. Later that week, he stood before a classroom full of teenagers at a local high school. He wasn't wearing a robe, just a gray suit, tie slightly loose, sleeves rolled up. He told them about the law, what it was meant to do, and what it sometimes failed to do. He talked about fairness, about fear, about speaking up when it's hardest. One student raised his hand. You ever screw up, Judge? Marcus didn't hesitate. Yes, he said plainly, more than once. But you're a judge. And I'm also human. That's why we have to keep learning, keep showing up, even when it's uncomfortable, especially then. The kids listened. Some nodded. Some didn't. But Marcus left knowing he had finally started something that felt like justice. One night, weeks later, he received a letter. No return address. The handwriting was familiar, firm, slanted slightly right. Marcus, you didn't say anything when they dragged me away all those years ago, but you didn't stay silent this time. That matters. I'm not healed, not yet, but I see you trying. Good. He folded the letter carefully and placed it inside his desk drawer. Not hidden, just protected. Months passed. The courtroom continued to fill with cases. Some straightforward, some gut-wrenching, but Marcus changed. He listened harder, questioned more. When officers brought in vague charges or unclear evidence, he pushed back. When defendants showed signs of being swept up by circumstance rather than crime, he took notice. And every so often, after court adjourned, he'd stand on those same courthouse steps, scanning the street. He never saw Valerie again, but her presence lingered, not like a ghost, but like a compass. One evening, he spoke at a bar association panel. A young lawyer asked, "Judge Blake, how do you stay neutral when the system is clearly flawed?" He smiled, not dismissively, but with quiet fire. "I've learned that neutrality isn't the same as fairness," he said. "And justice, real justice, requires more than following rules. It requires courage. It means looking back, owning what you missed, and doing better with what comes next." As the applause faded and the crowd dispersed, Marcus stood alone at the podium. He thought of a summer night under a Mississippi sky, two kids lying in the grass talking about escape, about change, about something better. Back then, he had laughed off the idea. Now he lived it, or tried to, and that, finally, was enough to start with. Justice isn't just a courtroom verdict, it's a daily choice we all make in how we see and treat others. A.New reminds us that silence can be just as powerful as action, and just as damaging, like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. once said, "In the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends." Judge Marcus Blake learned that real justice requires more than law. It demands courage, reflection, and accountability. This story shows us that even if we can't change the past, we can shape the future by owning our role in it. If this story moved you the way it moved me writing it, I'd love to hear what you think. Drop a comment, share your thoughts, and hit that like button. And if you're someone who believes in the power of real stories to change hearts and minds, please subscribe. Let's grow this community together, story by story.